There is no scientific evidence that pornography changes your brain. That doesn't mean that all of it is great and we should all have unlimited access. We can have compulsive behaviors around all sorts of things.
Yeah, for sure.
It's just telling someone that they're an addict and sending them to a rehab does not actually help them. I was the Hell House abortion girl, and this is nothing like what we pretended it was.
I marched in the March for Life many times. I had this black shirt that just said literally, abortion is homicide. You could see that thing from outer space. The font was so big. What's up, friends? Yes, we are back in studio, episode number 2 of a live interview, this time with me and Erica Smith. She is a sex educator. And on this episode, I'm just warning you, we talk a lot about the P word, porn. Yep, we went there today. We talked about it openly, honestly, and what do we do about it? How do we navigate that? And also, is it as damaging or more damaging than what we've been told? I'll let her answer that question for you. Hey, I would love to know, before you skip to the intro, I would love your thoughts, love your feedback in the comments. The other thing I want to know from you is if you like this in-studio format. I love doing this, but it only makes sense if this is what you want to see more of. So let me know in the comments. Enjoy this conversation with me and Erica Smith. Talk to you all later on. So I was born in 88, so I was more like a 90s, 2000s, right? The best way I can frame it is that essentially whatever was coming from the upstream of the evangelical gatekeepers in a really weird smorgasbord like combination, that's what we couldn't watch.
Okay.
It wasn't so much a rhyme or reason more than, Dr. James Dobson says this thing is bad.
Yeah.
Therefore, I believe it. Therefore, my kids can't watch it.
Yeah.
Or even like Bill Gothard, right? My parents were not like Bill Gothard acolytes, but there were things about his perspective that trickled into their church that without them even knowing who Bill Gothard was, all of a sudden we couldn't watch a certain movie or TV show.
Yeah.
So it wasn't really, there wasn't a real strict like logic to it all the time. It was mostly around curse words and sex, and if something seems magical.
I was just going to say that, like magician stuff.
Yeah.
What about like when Halloween came around?
Yeah. Well, this is where this is so interesting talking to someone who did not grow up evangelical, right? Because it is quite wide. So a very common thing is you have the Harvest Festival. So a Harvest Festival it would replace Halloween. Matt, were you able to trick or treat as a kid? Okay, so Matt could do this, but most kids could not. I also could trick or treat. My parents were cool with it, which is kind of odd given I couldn't watch Captain Planet. But a lot of parents
Or dress up as Captain Planet for Halloween.
definitely could not do that. But I could dress up as Peter Pan, which he flew and never
There's
grew
magic.
up. Yeah. It doesn't make sense. So you have these harvest festivals that you would go to instead of trick or treating or with trick or treating, right?
Yeah.
And that was like the safe way of celebrating Halloween. Some traditions, though, in particular, the more charismatic ones, some of them did these productions called Hell Houses.
I have a Hell House story for you, Tim.
Oh, you got to tell me
You're
now.
not gonna. This Hell House story is. It's so unbelievable to me that I tell it often, but since you haven't heard it, so one of my first jobs in sexual health care is that I did work in an abortion clinic, and I was a counselor. So I would talk to people about their procedures, tell them what was going to happen, and I would hold their hands and talk to them as the procedure was occurring.
Wow.
It's a 10 minutes or less. It's like not a very involved thing for the, you might have questions, but the gist of it is.
Yeah, I do, but I'll put a pin in that.
The gist of it is when I first moved to Philadelphia, so this was probably in 2002, I was working at an abortion clinic in Center City, and I was holding this girl's hand. She was so chill, and she didn't seem that upset. And she goes, this is really familiar to me. And I said, well, I did your intake. You told me that you had not had an abortion. And she said, oh, no, I haven't had an abortion before, but I was my church's Hell House abortion girl.
I knew where you were going with that when you said Hell House and then started telling this story. And that's a real thing.
She said, I was the Hell House abortion girl, and this is nothing like what we pretended it was.
Right. Because again, let's go back to the framing I was taught, right? That abortions are done by women who just want to murder children. They are usually botched. Most women who have an abortion have like major complications. They have deep, deep regret that they can never get over. And it's these like evil abortion doctors who just want to like kill kids. That was kind of the narrative that I was given.
Yeah.
And the reasons why people have abortions is only for selfish and terrible reasons. And of course, a lot of them would wait until the third trimester.
Yeah,
right?
just for extra effect.
Exactly. But that is kind of, I'm definitely summarizing a lot into one sentence, but that was the impression you would get.
Yeah. Well, she said that the abortion scene that they did in the Hell House involved like a ton of blood.
A ton
of blood.
Yeah.
And, you know, in this instance, there was not even a drop of blood visible to the woman undergoing the procedure. So,
well, it's interesting because at one point in my life, I was going to go to what's called a master's commission. This was hosted by the Assemblies of God. It's like these discipleship schools where essentially, instead of going to college, you would go to this ministry school. You would pay, it was pretty affordable, like $3,000 for the year or something. At the time, it was not accredited. I'm not sure if it is now. And you would come out with like this certification for practicing ministry. But it was pitched to you as like a real radical, give your life to God for a year. You couldn't date. You couldn't watch rated R movies. Like you lived off of like $25 or $50 a week. And a couple of my friends went and they came back with like stories of awe and wonder and how God showed up. And they had a recording where they swore that angels showed up with them while they were doing worship. And of course I was 18. I wanted to be all about that.
Yeah.
I wanted to be radical for Jesus. So I'm like, I was really tempted to go. And they told me about how they did these hell houses.
Oh.
I never been to one.
Okay.
And because I grew up in a more like conservative tradition in the sense of it wasn't as charismatic. So we didn't really do hell houses. So when they told me, I was like, dude, that's crazy. They're like, yeah, it's like a haunted house, but we get to run it and scare the heck out of people to hopefully get saved. And I was like, whoa, that's so radical. And now, of course, being 14, 15 years post and hearing this story, I'm like, yeah, that's pretty traumatizing.
Have you seen the documentary about them? It's from around that time period. I think it's from 2003 or something.
I might have seen pieces, but I vaguely know what you're talking about, but I don't think I've seen the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't watched it since back then, but that was my orientation to hell houses, was just like that girl just so nonchalant during her own procedure.
Explain this to me, though. How did you, because you didn't grow up in this world that many of us grew up in, and a lot of your work now actually has to deal with evangelical culture, especially around purity culture, women's rights issues, I would assume, things like that, queer rights, etc. How did you find us? Like, how did you find the bubble of being on the outside?
I feel like folks kind of found me.
Oh, okay.
Here's the general background. I grew up in a family that is culturally Christian, and I think my parents for sure identify as Christian, but I was not raised with a God that was scary. So that to me is the main difference. Like, to me, when I was a kid, God was watching, and God was you would go to heaven. Everyone went to heaven except for rapists and murderers. Everyone. So God was the nice figure up there, like to meet your grandma when she died, you know?
Got it, yeah.
So yeah, my upbringing was casually Christian, celebrated all Christian holidays in a very commercialized way. And I went to church occasionally with friends, or we would go to church on Christmas Eve. I've done a week of vacation Bible school here and there. I actually went to like Awana for a week or two.
Yes.
I had an ugly shirt.
Yes. Was it the Sparky vest that you had, or was it something else? The Pioneers shirt?
Oh God, I don't know.
There's a lot of them.
This would have been in like
Pioneers.
1990, and it was,
wow.
I feel like it was a shirt, like a button-up shirt.
Yes. Was it kind of grayish?
Yeah, it was gray.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow. The boys' version was called Pioneers. I think it was called Guards, or like light something guard was like the women's version of that.
Yeah, I wasn't there long enough to really have it
too bad.
So all that to say,
That's so funny.
that meant that I did not grow up in purity culture.
Right.
And my family is pretty open about sexual matters. And it's not because my parents are like, we're intentionally raising our kids this way. They're very chill, blue collar, working people.
Yeah.
And they just kind of, they're the best. My parents are the best. But we were not given all of these like scary parameters around sex or sexuality.
Yeah.
So I began working in the field of sex education basically when I was in college still, because I discovered feminism and women's rights and social justice and anti-racism when I was in high school. And I was very into all of that. A lot of it came to me through the punk scene. And the Riot Girl scene, that was the culture. That's my...
I'm laughing at you. I'm laughing with you because I'm thinking about how me as a high schooler, I was learning from Abeka and Bob Jones' curriculum, who were, Bob Jones was a staunch segregationist. So, and then I was in like this Christian punk rock scene that was giving me like the abortionist homicide t-shirt to wear. So it's just funny hearing the different experiences completely.
Yeah, and we've somehow come to this point together, because I would have been like, get out of my punk scene.
Right, and I would have been like, you're a worldly liberal,
Right.
like you don't know the true gospel.
Right. Yeah.
Wow, okay.
So
That's wild.
How I got connected to everybody that I work with now is like, I began a career in sex education and working in the sexual health field. And it was so evident to me from the very beginning, which was right when I graduated college, that the Christian right in America was dominating the conversation around sexuality and putting all of these restrictions in place around sex ed and reproductive rights. And I was seeing in real time how harmful that was to people. So we would have patients come into our clinic with such little sexual health education, and that was the reason that they were in the predicaments they were in. And whenever, our clinic had plenty of protesters, we got I was actually working in abortion care on 9/11.
Wow.
I was in the clinic, and we afterwards started getting fake anthrax threats from the Army of God.
Wow.
Do you remember the Army of God?
Vaguely.
So the Army of God, they were very involved in like Operation Rescue stuff. And Randall Terry was one of these guys that like bombed abortion clinics. And so was this guy named Clayton Wagner.
Okay.
I think Clayton Wagner is in prison forever. He was on a most wanted list at the time.
Oh my goodness.
And he was out terrorizing abortion clinics. And that was happening while I was working in them. So I come to purity culture from the perspective of, I've watched it happen from the outside for a really long time. I've watched how negatively it impacts people's ability to make sexual health decisions.
Yeah.
And when I started focusing specifically on purity culture, it is because the voices of people raised in it were really starting to be loud. And one of the first people, I always credit Linda K. Klein's book, Pure. I read her book and I was like, if there are people out there that feel this way, that have been harmed by purity culture, that feel like a real need for legitimate sexual health education, I would be happy to come in and be somebody to be a resource. And so I feel like, while not growing up in evangelicism, I've always been somebody that knew I was a target of wrath from that area,
Yes. Well, you had people giving you fake anthrax.
I did.
Threats.
And I mean, I was like, well, okay, whenever 9/11 happened, Jerry Falwell said it was the fault of abortionists, gays, feminists.
Yep.
I was like, check.
Yeah, right. Oh, it was because of me.
It was my fault.
Yeah, here we are. We have you. It's
right. I'm a terrorist. Exactly.
Well, I think what's interesting is there is such a caricature, right, of like that, right? It's these feminists and these abortionists and these queer people and liberals. And it's like, well, who are they? It's like, well, here we go. Like, here's someone who like was in that world, is a big advocate for sexual education, sexual autonomy, et cetera. And it's like, you're not that scary. I think you're actually quite nuanced. So we can have a real conversation,
Yes. I don't think I'm that scary. And I My philosophy is that I want people to have the information that they need to make the best decisions for themselves about sex and sexuality.
Right.
And
Right.
that means giving them education that they can use to make those decisions. And then it's not my business what they do after they have the education.
Right. Yeah, that's helpful. You mentioned that you just saw a lot of people, I'm assuming mostly women coming in, who were just dealing with the ramifications of this purity culture. What were some of like the consistent themes that you saw that gave to this like long-lasting, damaging situation that the person was in that was created by purity culture from your experience?
First and foremost, just such a lack of basic information about how their bodies work and how preventing unintended pregnancies or preventing sexually transmitted infections work.
Wow.
And I have examples over, if I've been doing sex ed work for 24 years, so I
Wow.
have lots of examples.
Yeah.
But I remember from those early days, we had women coming in who said, well, my boyfriend and we used a Ziploc bag and a rubber band as a condom.
No.
Yeah.
You're exaggerating.
That is not even the worst story. That is, honestly, Tim, someone's doing that right now in this city.
I don't mean, my reaction of almost laughing is not meant out of mocking.
No, I know.
It's just so unbelievable.
It's so unbelievable. But I remember girls calling the sexual health clinics I worked in and being like, I think I'm pregnant. And I would say, when was your last period? And they would be like, well, they hadn't had a missed period, but they had made out with somebody. I've known girls that have taken the morning after pill after kissing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Like, do you laugh? Do you cry? Do you?
It's the kind
just,
of
wow.
thing. It's both. At this point, I'm so compassionate for people who don't have sex ed information in a way that probably 20 years ago I would laugh about it more.
Right.
But now I'm like, I know why they don't have this information, and I know what not having this information does in their lives.
In your experience doing this now for over 2 decades, is most of this, in your estimation, the fault of primarily white evangelical purity culture, or is it just more also the cultural stigma in general of sex is really treated just not in unhealthy extremes, maybe of things are hypersexualized or things are undersexualized, and in your estimation, what leads someone on average to being like, hey, I use a Ziploc bag and a rubber band? Where is that coming from based on your experience?
That is such a great question. And I will tell you an anecdote to kind of answer. As part of my graduate studies in sexual health education, I went on a trip to study sexuality in Germany, France, and the Netherlands with other sexual health professionals. And we were looking at why their teenagers have such better rates they have such lower rates of unintended pregnancy, hardly
Really?
any teen pregnancy, hardly any teen STIs in these Western European countries.
Really?
And so our question was wow, in America, we have these skyrocketing rates of these things among young people.
Right.
What are they doing differently in Europe?
Right.
And so we went and looked at it on all levels. We looked at government policy, we looked at school sex education, and we also looked at the culture in families. And what we saw were that those countries, by and large, are not, at least when I was on that trip, which was in 2005,
Sure.
their governments were not as influenced by religious extremists. And the cultures in the family and in the home were very practical about matters of sexuality. So in a lot of these Western European countries, they have family life education curriculum that starts very young, which teaches kids things like, this is how your body works, and this is what it's like to have a good relationship, and this is what consent is and respect. In addition to that, there are government policies that fund condoms, free condoms, and free testing, and universal health care in some of these places.
That would be so nice. What's that like?
And then, so they were not, these countries were not as under the thumb of religious influence, and that is why they're having these such better outcomes. I would say that American culture from day one has had pretty narrow, restrictive ideas of what acceptable sexuality was. And we see that in the history books. There's written documentation of like white Europeans coming to this land and being horrified by the sexual culture of the indigenous people. By like, wow, they have sex for pleasure. The women do stuff that is manly. They're not always monogamous. And this was outrageous to a lot of the white Europeans who were very religious.
Right.
And, you know, they wrote this stuff down in their letters. So when I talk about purity culture,
wow,
I talk about it as not just, you know, there's the purity culture you grew up in, which is, you know, intense. But then there's the larger purity culture that I believe is baked into the fabric of American society.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to parse out, because as I've been learning more about just our nation, its founding, a lot of the elements that are in play, I'm like, you know, it seems like it's funny because evangelicals, I'm speaking very broadly here, this is not every evangelical, right? But as a group, especially white evangelicals, love to be like, oh, this is the biblical view of sexuality. But then when you read the Bible, you're like, I don't know, man. Like, there's a lot of like non-monogamy in the Bible. There's a lot of moments where you're like, God was cool with this. Like that would, my pastor would never agree to this relationship that I'm a part of now if I was using the biblical measure, right? And it's just kind of all over the place. Like, there's some verses that say this and some verses that say that. So like, where's this coming from? And I do feel like the more I've been digging and reading, the more I'm like, well, I think a lot of this actually comes from like white European standards that were kind of brought over here about like what the ideal family is. I mean, even the concept of the nuclear family. I hate to, you know, break it to all the evangelicals watching this, but that's not a very biblical concept, because the ancient Near Eastern culture of the biblical world was much more about a family and extended family unit, not a husband and a wife and their 2 kids.
Or their 8, 10,
right,
12
right,
kids.
Exactly. Yeah, or 100, however many, right? Like, and so I do think a lot of like, I'm not sure, maybe we're using biblical language to justify it, but if you actually read that Bible, you're not going to come away thinking, oh, the nuclear family is how God designed it, because you just read a few chapters into Genesis and there's no more nuclear family. It's like a man and his women, that's the actual language, and their kids, and, you know, the father. Anyway, so it's just interesting to kind of hear you say that.
Yeah, I do. I mean, the word puritanical, we know it's Puritanism. It's Puritans came to this country, or this land rather, it wasn't a country, because they were being persecuted and they wanted to be more conservative than things were shaping up for them. So the sexual ethic that we think of as purity culture, I feel like you can trace it all the way back to then.
And interestingly enough, it doesn't seem to really be working, because you mentioned how when you compared it, this is in 2005, but still not that long ago, 2 decades ago, how when you compare it to other European Western countries, they're not having these massive outbreaks of like, you know, teen pregnancy and STIs, et cetera. And it's funny because you would think, and I understand the logic, well, if we really regulate sex and we really regulate sex around these tight boundaries, the result should be
that
less of whatever it is.
Exactly.
But the reality is people just do it in the dark, metaphorically and literally. And then the result can be what we're talking about now.
And these European teenagers are having sex. It's not that they're not, but they are so much better equipped with maturity around the topic and decision-making capabilities and the practical information they need to be like, this is a risky behavior. How will I mitigate the risk? I will use a condom. I will get tested. I can be open with my parents about the fact that I'm sexually active. And those things are like really, really protective factors.
I really struggle a lot. And I've struggled with this for a while, even before I deconstructed and started TNE. I never understood this really weird perspective from the pro-life crowd. And I was someone who was pro-life. I mean, I marched in the March for Life many times. I had this black shirt that just said literally, abortion is homicide. in like massive, you could see that thing from outer space. The font was so big. And on the back it said, "You will not silence my message. You will not mock my God. You will stop killing my generation." It was like very emphatic. So I was in that world for sure. And even pretty early on, I was like, well, okay, if we think abortion is murder and we want to stop murder, and one way to stop murder is by giving people access to contraceptives and sexual education, and that would stop them from getting pregnant unplanned.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
It sure does.
And for some reason, the response was, no, we can't encourage degeneracy or something like that, right? And I'm like, well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. People are going to have sex, right? That's normal. That's a very normal human function. And we could easily help people not get pregnant, which would solve the whole murder thing that you guys are claiming is happening, right? But instead, it seems like you want to ban abortion everywhere for every reason, especially now with the rise of what's called the abolitionist movement, right? It's like this extreme, which is saying something. It's this extreme pro-life rhetoric that says, well, if abortion is murder, we should punish the women getting abortions because it's murder, right? That's a real movement that is growing inside of these right-wing Christian nationalist spaces. And it's like, well, I guess you could advocate for this really hardline view that probably is never going to happen anyway, hopefully, knock on wood. But also, like, again, why don't we just equip people with sexual literacy and consent and contraceptives and kind of cut this thing off at the pass?
Yes, that is what would happen if logic prevailed and if compassion for other humans prevailed. And I just actually talked about this on my social media yesterday. With the Dobbs decision criminalizing abortion in so many states, there's actually been a rise of bills against good sex education.
Right.
So it's like the point isn't to actually reduce the number of people who are having, who are pregnant and don't want to be. It's to enforce a very, very narrow sexual ethic on everybody.
Right. Now, tell me, maybe this is the wrong language to use, so if it is, just correct me. But the way I think about it is, I think about like what might be called a necessary abortion, where like something medically is threatening the life of a mother or something, versus like what I would call an unnecessary abortion, meaning if they had access to contraceptives and had consent and all that, they wouldn't need to get to this place anyway because they would never have gotten pregnant. I think about it like in those two categories. Again, I'm not sure that's the best language for it, but I think about how, first off, abortion rates have been dropping for a long time, and now they kind of actually rose after all this stuff happened with Roe v. Wade being overturned and some of this new trigger legislation coming into play, which should say something. But again, I'm like, guys, I'm all about getting to a place where like anyone doesn't feel the need in secret to go to a clinic, right, to have an abortion when they could have just said, when instead they could have had access to contraceptives and never even been put in that place anyway. It just, it helps, it melts my mind when I think about how Christian nationalists go, no. It's like, well, what do you want to happen? Like, what mythological utopian dream for you, which is someone else's nightmare, do you really think is going to it needs to happen for your final goal of no abortions ever taking place?
No sex at all, except for married, white, heterosexual Christians.
I know. I don't want to say the word, but I'm going to say it. Handmaid's Tale. Like, it feels very Handmaid's Tale.
I never read that book. So when people, and I never watched the show.
The show is
I won't
jarring.
watch it because
it's jarring.
I turned on the first episode and it was I was like, nah, I don't like to think about this shit in my free time, Tim.
I think we watched like 2 seasons and I'm like, you know what? This is so dark.
Yeah.
But I have enough in my mind to be like, I'm when life imitates art, I'm a little concerned. And when I hear from some of these people who are saying things almost verbatim that are in that show, I'm like, this is going to end really bad for everyone except straight white men.
Straight white men, yeah.
And those who assimilate into it,
yeah.
Into that kind of thinking.
For so many reasons. We would, assimilate into that kind of, for protection, for surviving. It's... and in this country, anytime someone mentions The Handmaid's Tale, I definitely want to bring up the fact that there have always been people in this country who had their reproductive freedom stripped away from the beginning.
Yeah.
And that would be women of color, like Black women, Indigenous women. Latinx women or Latina women, like, birth control experiments happen non-consensually on many of those women. Have you ever heard the term Mississippi
Yes.
appendectomy? Mm-hmm. Non-consensual hysterectomies of Black women? Yeah.
Sterilization.
Yeah. Sterilization. Yeah. All that.
Yeah. It's real.
Yeah.
Again, things that you're not taught. Mm-hmm. I wasn't taught anyway, especially with my homeschool curriculum.
I learned about that stuff in college when I was
unbelievable.
Studying women's sexual health. And
it's jarring. Again, you read that and you go, wait, we as a country, I'm just trying to, maybe I'm overemphasizing the point, but like it's so bizarro to grow up in one understanding of America and the American culture, that we're the best and we're the beacon of freedom and anyone can become something here. And then you find out decades later by reading like history from Black voices and other voices, and you're like, wait, what's it called? Black Wall Street. We demolished that. Like we just totally carpet bombed the whole place.
That was in Kansas or Oklahoma?
I believe it's Oklahoma. I could be wrong. But like, all this Black wealth was exploding and then just white people came in and tore the whole thing down. I never knew about that. Or like, to your point, these forced hysterectomies.
Yeah.
What? Like,
no, that's not going in any textbook.
It very much is it is MLK's like two Americas. And it's very jarring when you are pulled out from the matrix of the America you were given and realize that this is not the norm for millions of people throughout American history.
Yeah.
It's jarring.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the main reason, though, I'm glad we talked about all that. I'm glad we had that conversation. But I wanted to bring you on mainly to talk about initially, I'm going to say the P word on YouTube.
P word.
Porn.
Yep.
Porn.
Yep.
This is here's my guess. I'm totally spitballing. I think because a lot of my audience, a lot of our community is deconstructing purity culture and even versions of their theology and faith, I think a lot of folks are perhaps more curious than ever about this topic and like how to navigate it, because when you start loosening maybe your really tight sexual boundaries, right? You're willing to think about things differently and maybe not think that something is as dangerous, but you don't want to be too extreme and get involved in something that could be dangerous, etc.
Yeah.
So I wanted to bring you on because you've done a lot of research on this topic, and I think that you can help me and the audience navigate this thing that is around us all the time. It's accessible on our phones. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. I think it's like any broad topic. It's not all evil. It's probably not all good.
Yep.
It's just complicated. I want to start here though.
Yeah.
Here's the narrative I was given as a young man in church.
Okay.
Porn scientifically rots your brain. Every time you look at porn and you orgasm, it's the same thing as being on cocaine. It stamps your brain for that image, and that sears your brain to that thing. It becomes an addiction, like an uncontrollable addiction. Porn will definitely destroy your marriage. And if you look at porn long term, it will lead you to watch more and more violent things that will eventually get you into watching incredibly depraved things, and then you'll end up in prison. Yeah. That was kind of the narrative I was given around pornography.
Yeah. And that was very intentional.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
I think it worked sometimes. And then, of course, secretly, many times it did not, right? And so I'm just kind of curious for you, being on the outside, when you first discovered names like Dr. James Dobson, this focus on the family ethic, this anti-porn crusade, what you thought about it and how you view pornography now as someone who's trying to navigate ethical sexual boundaries.
Yeah. I have so much to say on this, so
Perfect.
I think you're ready for all of that.
I'm ready.
When I started focusing my sex ed specifically on people that had been raised in purity culture, I noticed that pornography was a big trigger topic for people.
Yeah.
And I was, at the beginning, my clients were all women. I have a lot of clients of other genders now. A lot of men are my clients. But at the beginning, it was women. And I would hear, their stories of like being so upset that their partners looked at porn, but also being like, but sometimes I like it too, and feeling so conflicted about that.
Yeah.
And then I started talking to men who were like, I was sent to a porn rehab by my wife and my pastor. And I remember one specific guy, he told me that. And I said, how often were you looking at porn? And he said, I looked at it about 3 or 4 times a year. And that was enough for his wife and his pastor to decide he needed to go to what I will put in quotes, a rehab. So when did I feel like I didn't become aware of the narrative around pornography from an evangelical perspective until I really started doing this work.
Okay.
And I started looking into, for example, the Porn Kills Love
Yes.
organization.
Yes.
And just being like curious about like, what are they telling people? Where's their information coming from? And when I decided that I decided like I need to teach a class that's about pornography for people raised in purity culture. And I wanted to tell everyone what the actual research says about the effects of pornography. I wanted to tell people the history of pornography. I wanted to tell people where the research came from that was, the research that gets cited about like addiction and changing your brain and all of that
like
stuff.
Changing your brain chemistry.
Yeah. So I started looking into all of that, and it was so fascinating to me because just by virtue of trying to find information about the effects of pornography, the first thing that became apparent is that this entire conversation is being dominated by evangelical voices and Mormon voices.
Interesting.
And it was difficult for me to find information. So if you Google, what does porn do to people? What are the effects of porn? The first page of Google results are all Christian porn rehabs. So, people paying for getting their SEO so they can be right on that.
Right.
So if you're looking for information, first you have to go through this. Okay, this is a rehab. This is a church. And I was looking at that, and it wasn't until like page 2 of the Google results that there was something from Psychology Today, which is still like, a pop psychology website, basically. And I was like, this is so interesting. And then I started talking to people I know who aren't particularly religious, people who did not grow up with this hardcore messaging. And they were still like, well, porn is really bad for you. Porn changes your brain. And I was like, where did you hear that? And so then I started, this is all me like frantically on my laptop, like trying to get to the bottom of this.
Right. Yeah.
And
Detective Erica on the case.
Yeah. I find that, I found an article in Men's Health magazine that was like, what are the effects of pornography on your marriage? And I'm like, okay, let's see what's going on in this article. And Men's Health obviously is not a Christian magazine.
No, not at all.
It's like how to get abs and strong erections, like that's Men's Health.
How to be a man's man.
Yeah. Like paleo diet, like that's Men's Health. So I was like, well, they're not going to have, an overtly Christian bias in this article. And I start reading the article, and they're citing an expert in his research on pornography. So I Google that guy, and he's a researcher, a professor at a small evangelical college. And I was like, but he sounds like what he's saying. The people that wrote this article for Men's Health probably didn't consider the angle he was coming from, that there was like his theology behind it. Another article I found in another, what was it? Some other article I found that sounded very non-religious was I would Google the person that was giving their information in that article and trace them back to BYU. So like that kept happening and kept happening. And what I eventually put together is that the view of pornography that comes from evangelicals and Mormons has really intentionally been, spread out to the rest of the world. And people are accepting it without question, without thinking, well, the people that put this information out there, what are their other beliefs about sexuality? And there's the Porn Kills Love thing, for example. They love to say that this is non-religious. That's their thing. Like, this isn't about religion. This is just, it's a public health issue.
Like human decency.
Yeah, it's a public health issue. Pornography as a public health issue was not decided on by any public health professionals. That was decided on by clergy. So if you've ever heard someone say porn is a public health issue, that came from religion. That didn't come from science. And so if I'm just gonna ramble. I have so much to say.
Please,
Hopefully
I want you to ramble.
Good. Okay.
Yeah.
So
ramble away.
looking back at some of the organizations that speak up the most against pornography, there's definitely the Porn Kills Love. Porn Kills Love is it's affiliated with the Mormon Church.
Okay.
They'll tell you that, they're not, but the people that founded it are Mormons, and like the director of research for them is somebody whose main research interest at BYU is like preserving the family. So, you can start to see these things if you look.
Yeah.
And there's an organization that calls itself the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, NCOSE, right? NCOSE used to be an organization called Morality in Media. They started like in the 1960s when pornography was like magazines and peep shows. Playboy magazine started back in that day, and they were like, no, we don't want people to look at pornography. So Morality in Media would crusade against, sex toys and peep shows and magazines and all of that stuff. And they realized at a certain point that just telling people that watching porn was wrong and that it made God angry wasn't actually an effective strategy.
Yeah.
So they very intentionally rebranded to be the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, which sounds so legit, right? Because
I would think it's like a government-sponsored organization.
Of course. And it sounds very similar to the National Organization for Missing and Exploited Children.
Right.
So that's very intentional. The rebrand was done by a conservative think tank, and they became NCOSE, NCOSE. And they pivoted to saying pornography is just bad because religion thinks it's bad and God doesn't want you to look at it, to saying this is a public health issue, this is going to harm you. And they also started saying that they were very concerned about the people in the movies. Like, we're concerned about the exploitation of women, of children, but NCOSE it's morality in media. Their whole thing from the beginning is to have a very narrow definition of sexuality and sexual ethics based on their very fundamentalist worldview. So with the organizations like them and with Porn Kills Love and God, there's another one. I feel like I should have looked at my notes before I started talking about this.
That's all right.
There's Exodus Cry.
Yeah, Exodus Cry.
Exodus Cry. That was the one.
I see them all over Instagram.
Yeah. So they are another one that they'll say that they care about exploitation.
Right.
But they don't actually, anyone that is involved in making pornography, if they won't listen to those people, like the sex workers, the women that are actually in the movies that are like, hey, this isn't it. We don't want you to shut down our whole industry. I'm doing this of my own volition. And actually what I need are some legal rights. Exodus Cry won't work with those people at all.
Well, what's interesting, this is definitely helpful because, and I'm sure we would agree on this, obviously we don't want anyone to be exploited, right, for someone else's pleasure, etc. And sometimes they do seem to have former actors or actresses, whatever, and people in the industry who will say things I'm like, whoa, like that sounds really jarring. Like that sounds like it was a really abusive experience for you. And so obviously what I don't want to say is personally is like, oh, well, Exodus Cry is nefarious, so this person's story is totally not legitimate, right? But do you think, what I'm kind of hearing you say is like, that story can be true and they can also be using that story for a more nefarious purpose?
Yes. It's floating around online still, but in order to join and be part of Exodus Cry, you used to have to pass or take this. It was like a list of like moral. That's not the word I'm looking for. It was a questionnaire basically about, have you had same-sex desire and attraction? Have you ever had a psychological issue? Like it was a morality clause that you had. And then like, if you're just joining this organization because you're against pornography and you're against sexual exploitation, why are they asking you if you've ever had gay thoughts? You know what I mean?
Right.
So the main thing that I feel like I always want to tell people is there's such a thing as porn literacy, which is being very aware of the content you consume and how it isn't real. But there's also literacy about the information about porn that you consume. And if all of the information you're getting about pornography comes from organizations that are linked to fundamentalist churches and fundamentalist organizations, then I want you to look beyond that and ask questions, because I don't want to get my information about whether pornography is good or bad from an organization that thinks that the only acceptable sexual behavior happens in a straight marriage.
Yeah, that makes
so
sense.
Their idea of sexual expression and what's okay is so narrow and fundamentalist. You're not the people that I want telling me information about pornography.
Right.
And in fact, the actual research
Yeah.
done by
Give me that.
neuroscientists, done by people that study how the brain functions,
Yeah.
and they study addiction, and they have labs where they put a bunch of things on your
Right.
head and
Right.
make you have you watch movies. That research, I primarily rely on the research done by Dr. Nicole Prousey. She's a neuroscientist, and she has done studies that show that when people when people watch pornography, their brains do not behave in the same way that an addict's brain would behave in relation to the substance they're addicted to. They don't light up at all in the way that you would expect.
Right, because I was told that.
Yeah.
Like, there's no difference between watching that video or being on the street and looking for the next high.
Yeah.
Like, it's the same kind of thing.
No, I mean, there is no scientific evidence that pornography changes your brain. Pornography I'm like, it doesn't change your brain. That doesn't mean that all of it is great and we should all have unlimited access.
Right.
But it
Yes,
truly
yes.
doesn't do those things, like imprint this image and then you're seeking more and then you're just shooting up. Like
Right.
it's not that. Furthermore, there's been research done by Dr. David Lay that says that people that grow up with all of these shaming messages around pornography are so much more likely to self-report that they're addicts. Because if you are given the message, don't look at it, it's bad, it's going to ruin your life, it's going to fuck you up irreparably, you look at it once and you're like, oh my God, I'm the worst person ever. You look
Right.
at it twice, I must be an addict.
Right.
So there's a correlation there with the people that self-report as addicts. They are by and large people who were told that pornography is really, really, really terrible. So the bottom line is you can absolutely have a problem with your viewing habits. They
Right.
can interfere with your life.
Yeah.
But at this point, there is no such thing clinically as porn addiction or sex addiction. And our layperson's understanding of what addiction is different than the clinical definition of addiction.
Yeah.
There has been something put on the books a couple years ago about like a compulsion. Like you can have compulsive behavior towards pornography, 100%. But treating as an addiction is actually really counterproductive. It's really unhelpful. So say you have a friend and you're like, I know he's unhappy with his porn viewing habits. He feels like it interferes with his life. It's really causing a rift in his marriage, and you're concerned about your friend. The worst thing to do would be to send him to a rehab where they're going to treat it as an addiction when it doesn't actually function as an addiction. And one of these places is also likely to heap shame on him and continue to give him these very religious-based messages about pornography. And that kind of thing doesn't help somebody that is behaving compulsively around pornography. And there's at least one study out of, I believe it's the University of Utah, with a different approach that is geared more towards not total abstinence from it, but giving people the message that, like, you can look at it if you want. It's, we're not going to restrict it. Maybe you can think of it like giving people the different lens to think about pornography through and make it less of a stigmatizing behavior.
Yeah.
And the people that went through the study reduced their viewing drastically. And I liken it often to binge eating. If you tell someone you can't eat bread
Right.
is bad.
Yeah.
How often are they going to think about bread?
I'm gonna think about Domino's pizza all day.
You're going to think about bread all the time.
I need that sweet, like I need a carbo load.
Yeah, and then you're going to land face first in a pint of ice cream, a pan of brownies.
Wow, that sounds really good right now. You know what? Let's cut filming. I have somewhere to be.
that is restricting.
Yes.
Can cause a binging response.
Right.
And so you're seeing that play out in these studies of people that report compulsive behavior around pornography. If you're like, hey man, it's really okay to want to see a sexually erotic image or want to see something that stimulates you visually, if you take away the forbidden nature of it, then it's kind of like, oh, I actually don't need to look at this every day.
Yeah.
I don't need to look at this every night,
Yeah. It's like when someone says, don't think about a red elephant, what do?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, that makes sense.
It's not that people cannot have compulsive behaviors around pornography. We can have compulsive behaviors around all sorts of things.
Yeah, for sure.
It's just telling someone that they're an addict and sending them to a rehab does not actually help them.
I really wonder how the audience is hearing this conversation because, to be frank with you, it still makes me a little uncomfortable having such a public dialogue around pornography.
Yeah, totally.
Thinking about
with a
people,
lady.
Who's not my wife.
Yeah, you're not. I know. This is very not Billy Graham here.
Yeah, no, exactly. We're breaking all the rules. But I also think about I know that some folks listen who are more moderate or even more conservative than I am, and certainly I don't want to make those people feel uncomfortable either.
Yeah.
But I also believe in having as honest of a conversation we can have around topics that are difficult to talk about.
Yes.
And in particular with porn, I think a lot of people are trying to navigate the ethical nature of is it sinful or not? I can't necessarily answer that question for you directly
right. And of course I can't either.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you're definitely not going to, right?
I wouldn't even begin to try.
Right. I'm just trying to get to the bottom of was the narrative we were given similar to how we were given a narrative about sex, right? I was told, hey, if you can wait until you're married, you're going to have the best sex of your life all the time. It's a sex buffet. Okay. That was not
the second the ring goes on.
Totally, right? And honestly, me and my partner have a great sex life. It's never been bad, but it wasn't this utopian sex buffet narrative that you just kind of, are told is going to happen. And so that doesn't mean that I'm in favor of not thinking about sexual ethics or navigating that for people. Of course, we have to navigate that and think about it. But same thing goes here where it's I was just kind of taught my whole life that if there's one thing that will destroy me as a person and make me this crazy sex lunatic and will also destroy my marriage and reformat my brain, it's pornography, right? And so I'm just trying to get to the bottom of okay, what do we know about the data and science? And then from there, we can talk about all the other things we have to mention, yes, the ethical nature of it or the industry itself, right? And people who are the ones performing in these videos and how they end up and all that kind of stuff, right? So I think it's helpful. I think one of my questions about this is where did this narrative come from then about porn changing your brain and being this horrible thing? Did that come from evangelical culture? Is that somewhere else? How did it form?
In order to understand where this came from, you kind of have to go back and look at the history of pornography itself, which I have plenty to say on. So one of the things that I find fascinating, and I learned this in my human sexuality education, is that anytime humans have developed a new form of media, we have used it to make sexualized content. So, when we got the printing press, people were making dirty books. When we invented, we invented when
we
right when people when the first rudimentary cameras came about, they were taking photos of naked people. When the first moving pictures came about, there were early pornography films made. And I have seen some of these movies, and they're silent films. And the themes are very similar to themes that people find hot today. It's the man of the house interrupts the maid dusting, and suddenly they're having sex, and it's a silent film. They're wearing these petticoats, that stuff exists. So
I don't want to think about it.
I bring that all up to say that there's been a massive shift in the availability of sexual content. So it used to be, it was pornography was magazines, or pornography was videotapes that you had, like when I was a teenager, if you wanted, you couldn't just accidentally stumble upon porn. It wasn't in your pocket on your smartphone.
Right.
It was like someone's brother left a Playboy in the treehouse. You know what I mean? It was like not easy to get. So as the availability of pornography has become just everywhere, the conversation around it has changed. And these fundamentalist religious organizations like Morality in Media, they realized that just telling people not to look at it wasn't changing anyone's behavior, that there were still people going to the peep shows and making the movies and buying the movies. So the shift was very intentional to use the language of public health and using the language of it will change your brain. It's the number one public health concern for young people. Like that was a very intentional narrative.
I mean, that brings us to a very important question about like access to pornography on our smartphones and kids and people underage, right? Because I feel like we are in some new territory as a human, species with so much, right? With information, with technology, and of course then with pornography. I have 2 kids. I have 2 boys. They're 4 and 2. They're gonna, at some point, no matter how long I delay it, they're gonna have access to technology. And they're most likely gonna find pornography accidentally at first, where they're gonna be somewhere.
Or a kid will show it to them.
Exactly. Like something out of my control is gonna happen where they're gonna be exposed to some kind of sexually explicit image, right? We can put it that way.
Yes.
And I'm just like, okay, I get the adult thing. Hey, you're an adult, consent, it's not my life to live. You have to navigate those ethics. I understand that. When it comes to kids, teenagers, that kind of stuff, then I get, I want to make sure that we really do right by by the next generation, right? And don't expose them to things that their brains aren't primed to understand. And also, I don't want kids learning that pornography is sexual education. Just like how I wouldn't want them to watch a movie where there's some kind of like car chase and think this is how you learn how to drive, right?
That is exactly the metaphor that sex educators use. It
would be a terrible thing if my 4-year-old was like, or my 12-year-old was like, I know how to drive. I watched this movie. Yeah, exactly. Like, no, don't do that. So how do you recommend, because I know a lot of folks have kids, I have kids. How do we navigate that? And I think one of the things that I want to push on, because I think you and I disagree on this a little bit, and that's great, is I do see, even if it's for nefarious reasons, I understand the logic behind adult entertainment sites. I don't want to get flagged by YouTube. That's why I'm using that, not the P word. Having some kind of verification for your age being over 18 or 21, whatever it is. Because I really don't want kids stumbling upon that stuff, right? So kind of give me your thoughts. Like, how do you see parents navigating a very accessible world where at some point, young probably, these kids are gonna see some stuff that we don't want them to see yet?
I want to start by making it so crystal clear that I and other sex educators also don't want young people stumbling upon this content without any sort of adult to help them understand what they saw, which is probably going to be disturbing to them if they come upon it accidentally. So, I am absolutely not in favor of just being like everyone should have access to pornography regardless of age, and it's not harmful. That is not something I would ever say. So as sex educators and as people who work with families and children, everyone I know is very much for including conversations about pornography in the conversations you have with your kids, which requires getting comfortable with the topic yourself, which is, for many people, that's kind of the first place that you got to start. Like, can I have this conversation with my kid? But it has to start early because of the proliferation of smartphones, and you never know who's going to show your kids something on the bus. You have to ideally say to your child before they ever encounter this, if you ever see something on your phone or on your friend's phone that is like adults doing something that scares you or upsets you, or you don't know what they're doing, I want you to come to me and we'll talk about it. The number one most important thing is letting your children know that they won't be in trouble. So if one of your sons comes to you someday and is like, so-and-so showed me this, a naked lady on their phone, that you're not going to punish your kid for that, right? So the conversations have to start early. And the talking points change as the children get older. So for if like a 11-year-old or a 10-year-old stumbles upon this kind of content, it's like, I want you to know that what you saw wasn't for kids. It's something that is for adults, and it might be scary or confusing to you, and that's okay. If someone ever tries to show you that again, I want you to come tell me, so that they have that trust with you as the parent,
right?
And they know that, like, so if you had to intervene because there was a kid at school doing, trying to show them, or God forbid, an adult,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So that
actual grooming,
yes,
yeah,
so that you can build that trust with your child.
Yeah.
And as your child grows older, and not your in particular, as any kid grows older, perhaps they will seek out sexualized images because it is a natural curiosity.
Right.
It's a natural curiosity to be like, what are these people doing? What are these bodies doing?
Sure.
What do boobs look like?
Yes.
We all want to know what boobs look like.
As a very straight man, I can tell you a very early inclination, very early,
I've had clients tell me that they actually remember Googling naked boobs, and that was they were just like Googling, and that's how they like discovered.
No, honestly though, yeah, completely. That is it's reality.
Yeah.
And can I just say, it's interesting because something in me says this feels counterintuitive. Like, don't talk to my children early about this, because what if I'm exposing
what if
them?
They go look at it.
Yeah, exactly. But I think you're right ultimately, and I think that's wise advice. I mean, we try and use all correct terminology for all their body parts, right? I don't like say, oh, this is your wee-wee. I say, this is your penis, this is your elbow. So we're trying to be a little more like just normalizing, right? Just normal functions, right? And I want to be at a place, I think many people do, where they feel like they can have a very honest conversation with their child in a very appropriate way for their age.
Yes.
But I think a lot of us grew up in places where it was so shamed and so like not talked about. It just feels incredibly awkward to do that.
It is. And that is the number. I mean, I have so many resources for parents. And one of them is Dr. Tina Shermer Sellers wrote a fantastic book called Shameless Parenting. And it's specifically about each stage of development for children and what that might bring up for you as a parent. Like, oh, my child is, touching their genitals. That makes me uncomfortable. How do I process that before I talk to them about it?
Right.
So that, and the organization Sex Positive Families, they have so much comprehensive information about how to have these talks with children about pornographic content. And so going back to that topic in particular, so when children might be old enough to seek it out themselves, you want your kids to know that is not for children. That's not appropriate. That's not something that I think you should be doing. If you are seeing these images, please know that they are largely not based in reality. What you're seeing on these screens is performance. You are seeing actors.
Right.
You are not seeing loving relationships. You're not seeing, care between partners. You're not seeing the way that most people have sex or experience pleasure. You're seeing an action movie, essentially.
Yeah, right. Right.
And so that is what we call like pornography literacy, is having those. And I think that's important for all adults to know as well.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately, because we don't have these conversations openly in much of our country, there are so many young people, young men in particular, who get their education, quote unquote, because it's not good education, from pornography.
Right.
And they begin to believe, well, women like this violent aspect.
Yes.
Women are, unfortunately, they get the idea that like the way women experience pleasure is through these things they see in pornography that are largely exaggerated.
Yes. Right.
So, having these conversations with teens and adults alike is important. There's so much to say about this, about this topic. And another thing I would add is that, people wanting to view sexualized images because it's exciting to them is a very human impulse. There are theories about why we have sexual fantasies. There are theories about why we like to look at pornography.
Right. It's kind of, when you think about it, it's kind of odd, right? It's like I'm watching two people or more or whatever, have sex, and like, why am I into that? Like, why is there something in my body that is stimulated by that action?
I mean, because you're a human being wired to reproduce yourself.
Yeah.
So like evolutionary biologists believe that we like to look at porn we like to fantasize because it increases the likelihood that we ourselves will have sex, which is all, then we'll reproduce.
Nailed it.
Right. So there are reasons that we like to look at this stuff.
Yeah.
Some people do enjoy pornography. Some people don't.
Right.
That is a personal decision.
Yeah.
But for people that do want to view it, there are ways to do so that can guarantee you are not exploiting people.
Yes, that's really important.
Yeah.
Well, I want to be really clear to the audience. I'm looking at the camera now because this is a very sensitive topic for a lot of the world that I occupy. I'm still navigating it myself, and how do we think about that? None of this is you or I making some kind of moral claim saying here's what we're trying to say morally one way or the other. That's for you to navigate. If you're like, hey, you know what? This is not for me. I don't like how it affects my life. That is totally cool.
Yes.
And it's just, again, it's not for me to make that call for you, right? And so I just wanted to have you on to kind of give some of the more clinical data, just like, here's what we know. Here's kind of our hypothesis. Here's some things to be aware of. Here's some things when it comes to kids.
Historical context, too.
It just helps us hopefully allows us to make more informed and wise decisions. Yeah. That is not based just on propaganda or on dogma or on because some, idea of God says so, but because we actually have data for why this would be a good decision or not be a wise decision.
Yeah.
And that's really important to me as the audience tries to navigate their own theology and beliefs. That's going to affect their sexual ethics too, right?
Yeah. And I want people by and large to not feel so much shame about everything.
Right.
And that includes if you are someone who becomes aroused by pornography or interested in pornography, it doesn't mean that you were like the scum of the earth. It's a very human impulse to enjoy sexualized images. And I want people to make decisions that are best for them with a lot of information backing up those decisions.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Which is why I think it's so important to think about the source of all the information you've ever gotten about pornography. And I do understand, I will look at the camera now too, that if you were raised with such a negative message that probably you probably don't believe what I'm saying. And I understand that. Like, if you might feel in your soul, well, I know that porn kills love. Well, I know that porn's addictive. And I cannot make someone change their mind simply by providing factual info. Like, we know that.
Right.
But I think that in addition to understanding how our brains work and how our brains affected, it's important to think about the source of the information we're receiving and what other beliefs that organization carries.
Yeah.
So I don't want Mormons telling me that porn kills love when Mormons also think that I shouldn't be queer.
Right.
I don't want to hear what you have to say about my sexual decision making.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. And you're certainly not advocating for your sexual ethic being mapped onto everyone else, how they live their lives. So I'm
actually, I don't even talk that much about my personal sexual ethic. I don't. I think it's clear from what I do that I believe that sex ed is important.
Yep.
I believe that open conversations about sexuality are important. But as far as the decisions I make in my own life, most people don't have any idea what those are.
Yeah.
So, I'm not here to tell you to be like me.
Right. I love that. Well, if folks want to find more of your work, where can they find you?
So I am on Instagram very actively at Erica Smith Sex Ed, and then my website is purityculturedropout.com.
Love it.
Very easy to remember.
Very easy. Erica, I appreciate you making time. We'll see what the community thinks about this conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing the feedback.
I'm always happy to answer questions and respond to comments and provide my sources because
I love that.
I have a buttload of sources on this topic.
I'm all about it. Well, we'll talk again soon. Again, thanks for your time. It means a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Woo! What do you think, man? That one was a doozy.
Hi. Good to see you too.
Oh my God.
Your head.
It's okay, it happens a lot. That's a good blooper. This is Matt, our new guy.
Hi,
What's up? Here we are.
Game time.
Game time, baby.